Well, we've made it to Christmas, right? Your family should be all in town, ready to go, presents wrapped, all that good stuff. Just in case you're wondering, I did not hurt myself again this week. It's been a good week. However, the total number is 23. 23 bags of leaves from my yard. And if you drove by my house right now, it would look like I did none. So that's the problem, but you don't want to know about that. That's fine. Family's here. I'm not picking up any more leaves. Time is over anyways. It's Christmas. I love getting to celebrate Christmas as a church. Hopefully you've kind of gone through all of the process of getting ready, and it's here, right? It's Christmas Eve. Shopping should be pretty much done. You know, family should have done the traveling. Everything should have kind of gotten to where it needs to be. And so hopefully in the next day or whenever you celebrate Christmas with your family, things will maybe slow down for a moment. But then life just starts back up again, right? Like maybe you get a couple of days off from work, or maybe you get a few days away from like cooking and cleaning and doing all the things that we have to do in our everyday life. But life just keeps happening. It's back to work, back to the grind. And honestly, it gets kind of exhausting, doesn't it, sometimes? There's just so much to do at all times. You know, our world kind of functions with currency, and rarely is that currency money. Often it's an exchange of goods, services, times, principles. A lot of times it's what we have to offer. What we have to offer our jobs, what we have to offer our families, what we have to offer our world. And so we experience these things in our lives in order to produce whatever needs to happen, right? And we pay extra for time savings because we could be more productive giving our money rather than our time or our efforts. We give away things for convenience or comfort. I mean, imagine telling your great-grandma that you have your groceries delivered to your house. Right? What do you think your great-grandma would say to that? Right? That'd be probably not great. Right? You think about 150 years ago, how often did people go out to eat? Right? Not that often. And so we've created a culture now where we are pay extra for the convenience of our time or our productivity. And so productivity kind of becomes our idol, right? Our thing. We're linked to our productivity, and our paychecks are linked to how productive we are. Our self-worth often is linked to how productive we are, and even sometimes our identity gets wrapped up in what do I have to produce? Right? Most of the time men will meet each other, and you'll say, hey, my name's Kyle. Well, your next question is always, what do you do? How productive are you in society, right? What do you do? Because productivity is something that inside of us makes us think that somehow we're special or good or extra when we can be productive. You know, last week we talked about the Garden of Eden and how God created this beautiful world, right, for Adam and Eve to exist in, and their first experience as human beings was not to get to work, but it was the Sabbath rest. That the first experience that you and I as humans should have experienced in the Garden of Eden, the way it was designed, was rest. And that's because God designed us to find our identity and our humanity not in what we can produce for God, but how we can be fully dependent on Him. That our purpose in life as human beings are not about how much we can produce for our world, for our families, for our jobs, or for our church, even for our faith, but what God can do in us and how we can find identity and even our worth as humans in that dependence on Him. Yet that didn't last long, right? Adam and Eve were like, you know what? I'm tired of being dependent on God for right and wrong. I want to make the decision for myself. And so they were kind of tricked. But you and I experience this all the time too, right? We decide that instead of depending on God for things, we go and we take them, which is essentially what Adam and Eve did, right? We don't have enough time to produce what we need, so we steal. We can't produce happiness the way that we want to, and so, or maybe even joy, right? So we go and we overindulge in things to numb ourselves to the happiness we're seeking, right? Instead of looking for happiness and joy in God, we look for happiness and joy in relationships. And we decide that if I can be productive or if people around me can provide for me what I need, then somehow life will get better. But it doesn't. You see, God promised Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden when they sinned that not only were they going to not produce like they used to, but the earth is actually going to work against them. That you're going to have to try even harder to produce what you were producing in the garden, and you're going to continue to get less and less as time goes on. And then he tells the woman, you're going to have pain in childbirth. Now, this is kind of a weird translation thing, right? In most English versions of the Bible, we read pain in childbirth. And so most of the time we think, oh, that just means when a woman is giving birth to a child, there is pain. But in the Hebrew, this concept is much bigger than that. This is that everything surrounding the bringing of children into this world is going to have dysfunction. There's going to be problems. So the relationships between husbands and wives are going to have problems around childbirth, right? The relationships of those kids to their parents are going to be dysfunctional. The relationships of the kids with each other are going to be dysfunctional. And men and women and couples in the Bible are going to struggle to get pregnant. And if you read Genesis, that is exactly what happens, right? Well, the first siblings in the Bible do what? They kill each other, or one kills the other. Right? You have later on, you have Abraham and Sarah can't have kids. So what happens? God produces a child in her. Right? Jacob and Esau, brothers fighting with each other as they're coming out of the womb. Right? Husband and wife not on the same page, tricking each other. You look at Jacob later on. 2 wives, it's dysfunction. One of them he loves more and she was barren. The other one producing children, and the kids are fighting at all times. There's struggle between man or husband and wife. There's struggle between wife and wife. There's struggle between child and child. There's struggle all over the place. There are women after women in the Old Testament, in Genesis, that cannot have kids. And then Rachel, right, towards the end, dies in childbirth. There's so much dysfunction surrounding the birth of children. And so what makes the Christmas story so interesting to me is that it starts with 2 women unable to produce children. Did you notice that? You start with a woman who cannot have children, and God promises her the one who's going to come and announce the coming of the Messiah. And then you have another woman who, because she's never been married, right, has no ability to produce a child. And these 2 women are the ones who introduce us to the story of the Messiah. 2 women who couldn't have kids. See, it's interesting that we think about this way because over the past few weeks, we've been looking forwards and backwards about the story of God, the story of the Bible, the story of the Messiah, and how it all kind of comes to the birth of Jesus. And how all these prophecies and all of these stories being told, images throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament, and Revelation remind us that this is not just an ordinary child, that there's something different taking place here. And so we've talked about prophecies and plans and announcements and purposes. We've gone from Genesis to Isaiah to Matthew to Luke, even to dragons in Revelation, right? It was the weirdest nativity story ever last week. And as we start telling this story, we recognize there's these key ideas behind that, right? The love of God being expressed through the birth of his son for humanity. Talk about God's love is not this fleeting love, but that his heart grieves for the brokenness of his people. And so he has this covenantal, unchanging love, and he sends Jesus to come. We talked about how Jesus became the hope of the world and how God looked around at all the people that he had put in place in order to help people come back to him, and they failed. And so finally, with his strong right hand, he comes to bring hope to a broken world. Last week, we talked about biblical peace, the idea of shalom. That God is not just defeating sin for us now, but he is working out his plan to defeat sin and death forever through the work of Jesus that came as a baby but will one day come again as the rightful king. And I'll have all these words like hope and love and joy and peace. We meet Mary and Joseph and angels and wise men and shepherds and all of these people involved in the story. We see dragons and the right arm of God and stars and lambs. But as we get to Christmas, what does it really mean for us? Now, if you would, if you got a Bible in front of you or you got one on your phone, turn with me to Isaiah chapter 53. Now, I know this is not your most common prophecy that we read around Christmas. Often we read it on Good Friday, and that's okay. But the reason I want to read that is because I want to point out a couple things about the birth of Jesus. So if you would, Isaiah 53, I'm going to be reading verses 1 through 9. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of grief and sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one who men hid their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And by oppression and judgment he was taken away. And for his generation, who considered that he was cut off of the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Now, that's a rough prophecy to read at the birth of Jesus. I mean, if you think about this, maybe 700 to 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus, Isaiah is writing this prophecy that the Messiah is going to come, and this Messiah is going to experience this brutal life. That the people he's coming to save are going to be the ones who look at him and say, that man is cursed. That man's a liar. He doesn't belong here anymore. Let's kill him. And so Jesus comes knowing what he's going to experience. To think that a tiny baby born in a manger knew, maybe not knew, but God knew as he came that as he's born in a manger, one day his life will end at the brutal hands of the people he's coming to save. Think about the level to which his death was experienced, just being beaten and mocked and killed on a cross. Why would that happen? We'll continue reading here. It says, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring and he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make those to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. You know, I've got two boys. And they couldn't be more different than each other. You know, I sometimes think about what I want my sons to grow up to be. I want them to be faithful disciples of Jesus. I want them to be really good dads and husbands. I want them to be spiritual leaders in their friend groups, in their schools, in their families, in their church. I want them to serve in great ways. I want them to have all the tools that they need to succeed, and I don't want to watch them struggle. You see, the birth of Jesus, as God sends him to earth, he knows what he's sending him to do. God planned the birth of Jesus knowing that his life would end in death. And not just a quiet death, a brutal death. And so why would God do this? Why would God subject himself to the anguish of death? Why would he willingly step into human history knowing how it would end? Well, the answer is rest. The answer is rest, because from human history, from Genesis 3, humanity has been seeking rest. Rest, trying to produce in ourselves the salvation only Jesus can bring. And so you and I do all the things we try to do in our lives in order to bring us some sort of comfort or happiness or joy or even salvation, yet we're not able to do it. Because we identify ourselves not with the work of what Jesus has done, but with how productive we can be. And so Jesus offers us rest from trying to produce the fix to all the brokenness that exists in our lives, in our world, in our marriages, in our races, in our politics, and all over our lives. And in our best case scenario, if you look around at our world, the most productivity we've had has led to more wars, more suffering, more pain, and more sadness. This week I was reading, posts from other pastors and kind of texting some friends of mine, and, they said, I'm praying this week for all the people who maybe don't come that often to church. Usually Christmas and Easter are the Sundays where people maybe come because they're either obligated to come or because a family member dragged them or because someone promised them cookies afterwards. I don't know why. And even saying that out loud, you may be in here thinking, I feel shame and I feel guilt and I feel sadness. Because there's something inside of me that says I have to produce what God has already done. Maybe you walked in here and you feel disconnected, and not because God is distant, but because you've forgotten that there's a God who wants to be close. And so you keep trying to do all of the things to make yourself feel like you're close to God, and it keeps producing not what you want. You're trying to manufacture faith. You're trying to manufacture salvation. You're trying to manufacture emotional health or relationships or productivity. And every time you keep trying to manufacture these feelings or these desires or these identities, they keep fleeting away. And the more you grab them, the more they're gone. You see, God enters into human history with the announcement of a child through a barren woman. He enters into human history through a virgin mother. He enters into human history in the same way every other human enters into human history. But instead of living just like every other human, he lives a perfect life. A life free from sin, a life free from guilt, a life free from living the way you and I choose to live. And he lives exactly the way God calls him to live. But instead of winning at life and just moving on, what he does is he subjects himself to death on a cross. And he does so that you and I can stop trying to produce salvation in ourselves. You see, the work of Jesus gives us rest. And when we begin to understand that, we understand it begins to tell us things about ourselves. First, it tells us who we are. That since Jesus came to earth, that means as humanity, we are not forgotten, but we are loved, that we're accepted, that we're prepared for. 700, 1,000 years beforehand, God was preparing to save his people. You're worthy of salvation. The good news of the birth and death of Jesus is that it tells us who we are. And Paul talks about this in Ephesians chapter 2. Paul says, outside of God, you are dead. You're not dying. You're not on your way there. In fact, sin has caused you to be dead. In Ephesians 2, he tells us what happens. He says, because of your death, right, because of your death, there is nothing good that you can do to cover up the stench of the death in you. But then it says this, it says, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he has loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that at the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of grace in his kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not your own doing. It is a gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one will boast. A dead person trying to produce life doesn't amount to much. The God of the universe stepping into human history to breathe life back into his people is what the birth of Jesus meant. That you are worthy, that you are loved, that you are accepted, and that the God of the universe wants to be with you. That's why the good news of the birth and the death of Jesus connects us with God. It connects us back into the relationship that we have been trying to produce ever since, but refuse to understand. You go back to the Tower of Babel. What was the Tower of Babel was trying to get back to God, and they failed. In Hebrews chapter 4, the writer of Hebrews is using the idea of the Sabbath, right? The seventh day, the day of rest. to help us understand that we have a high priest who is beginning our process of celebrating the Sabbath, right? As the high priest gets up to announce the beginning of the Sabbath, so Jesus stands up and does that. In Hebrews 4, verse 14, it says this: "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and grace to help in the time of need." We can approach God not because we have anything to offer him, but because Jesus came into earth to live the life that we couldn't live, to die the death that we deserved, so that you and I can approach God again. At the beginning of Matthew, Matthew is quoting the prophet Isaiah when he says that you shall call his name Emmanuel. And Emmanuel means God with us. Not God with them, but God with us. When Jesus entered into human history, he gave us rest. And that rest means that we can spend eternity with God and Jesus forever. Now it'd be easy, and it really would be a good sermon just to walk away right there. We can find rest in God, but I think what ends up happening is that we begin believing as disciples of God that means all we have to do is just show up. Right? All we have to do is just show up anymore, and there's no need for us to really do anything as a follower of Jesus. And in one sense, the work of Jesus has been done. Maybe worse, maybe you've experienced the good news of Jesus and now you feel obligated to do all of the things that need to get done to keep what God has produced in you. And so maybe you don't desire producing salvation for yourself. You know that's not possible. But once you get it, it's your responsibility now to keep it. And the way this plays out is maybe you have a sin in your life, and every time you continue to fall into sin, you express guilt and shame and sorrow. Maybe you're really good at doing your daily quiet time, but the day you miss it, you feel guilt and shame. Maybe you feel obligated to do things, not because it is an outpouring of the love of God for what he has given you, but because you feel like there's something wrong if you do it. You see, God's love should overflow in us and produce devotion to him. That when we experience the love of God through the work of Jesus and his coming to be with us, what should happen is his love should overflow in us and produce devotion to him. That when we celebrate Christmas together, it should remind us of God's overwhelming, unchanging, covenantal love, and our response to him is worship and living out his mission to the world. Discipleship and being a follower of him and someone who is being changed by him and someone committed to his mission and being together in church community. The gospel should encourage us to seek rest and not trying to produce in us what we cannot produce, but finding rest in the joy and the peace and the hope and the love of our God coming to earth. Maybe you came here expecting to hear a cute little message about a baby in a manger and a story about a little boy who decides to drum to a newborn like a weirdo. I never understood that song. Right? Maybe you're like, cool, Christmas sermon, let's move on. And I want you to hear that there was a God who willingly stepped into human history knowing the lengths to which he was going to have to go to because he loves you. Because he wants to call you his own. Because he believes you are worthy of that love. Because he believes you are worth his death and the pain and suffering he endures. And so when Jesus gets born in this tiny manger and we have this cute little picture of what it looks like, God knew that he was coming for you. So you don't have to try to produce happiness and joy and salvation for yourself anymore because the King has come. Now, I'm becoming aware that there are many Christians who, even though their house guest has shown up at Christmas, they're still out in the yard raking leaves. Right? Like spring has come. Well, why are you outside? Your Messiah is in the house. And yet we continue to do all of the things that need to get done in our lives, and we miss out on the joy of Christ being with us because we're so busy running around trying to make sure we can produce what we never have the ability to produce in the first place. So you keep tidying up, you keep cleaning, you keep moving around, and all Jesus wants to do is say, come and sit with me. Come and be near. I want to show you the depths of my love. I want you to experience true joy and peace and hope and happiness. And so maybe this Christmas, you don't need to hear a story about a baby in a manger. You need to know that it's time to rest. Rest in the hands of a God willing to come to earth and die for you. That's the hope of Christmas. That's the peace of Christmas. That you don't have to work anymore. You can find rest. Would you pray with me? God, we love celebrating all the things surrounding Christmas, and sometimes we maybe forget that the work is done. That you knew the depths and the lengths to which you had to go through when you came as a baby. And yet you came anyway. And so God, I pray this morning that there is no one who leaves this room knowing the lengths to which you are willing to go through to express your love to them. There is no lengths to which you would go through to show that there is hope in this world through the work of Jesus. That people would know that with all the dysfunction that may be going on in their lives or in their minds, God, that there is a God who wants to bring them peace. And God, please help us to see all the ways we're trying to produce salvation, and let us find a rest in you. God, I pray this Christmas we would be reminded that you are a God who sees us as chosen and worthy and lovable, and that we would live every day in your presence. I just pray these things in your name. Amen.